One.
Hello, I'm Rich Leox, and welcome to the first session of CEBU's week-long symposium on vaccines. Arguably, nothing is more important than getting people vaccinated for the coronavirus, and we're going to dig into how that's going. We have two supremely knowledgeable people with us today to get us started. Dr. Amesh Adalja is a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security. His work is focused on emerging infectious diseases, pandemic preparedness, and biosecurity, and he's been a very busy man this year. And Yasmin Abutaleb is a national reporter covering health policy for the Washington Post with a focus on the Department of Health and Human Services, health policy on Capitol Hill, and healthcare and politics. If you have any questions as you're going through the session, please post them via the chat function and we will try to answer them. Thank you and welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
So Dr. Adalja, I think I want to start just by sort of talking about the lay of the land, what the state of play is. So which vaccines are authorized or close to being authorized in the US right now? And are there others like AstraZeneca or Novavax's vaccine that we can expect to be authorized in the next couple of weeks or months?
So right now there are two vaccines that have received FDA emergency use authorization, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. So those are the two that you would get if you went to a vaccine clinic, and that's what we're basically rolling out. There are, however, several other candidates that were invested in by Operation Warp Speed that we anticipate will get emergency use approval soon. The next likely to get is Johnson & Johnson, which is going through that process right now. It's a single dose vaccine, and I suspect it will be online probably early spring or maybe just before spring starts in late winter and maybe early March if everything goes well with the FDA committee. Then there are other vaccines like the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is available in the United Kingdom and other parts of the world. This is something that we're sort of waiting for the American phase 3 trials to be completed because there's some issues understanding what dose to use in this vaccine. The same is true with Novavax, which is another vaccine which uses a different technology. It's a 2-dose vaccine, and it's also something that is going through the UK process, the regulatory process, but hasn't started to submit for the US approval at this point. So I think eventually we'll probably have Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, and AstraZeneca as sort of our portfolio of first-generation vaccines. Down the road, maybe in several months to a year, we may have second-generation vaccines that are a little bit different. We know companies like Sanofi are using some of their flu technologies to make vaccines. So there may be other things that come out later on, but I think that group of 5 is likely what most people will get their first COVID vaccination with.
And are there significant differences between the vaccines, differences in efficacy or which strains they work against?
So it's hard to compare them head to head because they didn't do trials that way. The trials were against placebo. So it's very hard to do that. Although the press sometimes will say this was 90%, this was 85%, is this one better than the other? You can't really make those distinctions unless they're studied in a controlled manner against each other because there's many differences in trial populations and trial inclusion and exclusion criteria. But what I would say is, so if you look at Pfizer and Moderna, they both use what's called mRNA or messenger RNA technology. And they're very, very similar. They're both 2-dose regimens spaced 3 or 4 weeks apart, and they did show high efficacy, 90-95%, against preventing symptomatic disease and extremely high activity against preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. Now, the next vaccine to think about is like Johnson & Johnson. So that uses a totally different technology. Instead of mRNA, which is basically just a gene, they're using another virus to deliver the spike protein from coronavirus. So it's a whole different type of vaccine platform. And that's a single dose vaccine. And it does appear to have high efficacy. And you can go through Novavax and AstraZeneca, and they all seem to have that. I guess the question that most people ask is, what about the variants and how does these viruses stack up? So we know, we tend to think that the UK variant or the 117 variant, the first one that we worried about, the one that's hundreds of cases have been confirmed in the US, particularly in Florida, that one, it seems that all the vaccines are robust against. It transmits more efficiently, but the vaccines seem to be able to take care of it. There is some concern, however, with the South African variant, which is 135 is its number that people might hear it called. That variant, it does appear that at least with the Novavax, the AstraZeneca, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that there is decreased efficacy in preventing symptomatic disease. We don't know the answer for Pfizer and Moderna. We know that it increased the neutralization antibody titer, meaning the vaccine wasn't as potent against it as the original variant. But we don't know what that means clinically with those mRNA vaccines. But one thing I would just caution people, especially when you're writing, is that the fact that the press sometimes will say, that this didn't do as well. There's a couple of things. Remember, when we're talking about COVID vaccines, the goal is to prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And these vaccines look good in the face of the South African variant. So instead of a headline that said Novavax fares poorly against South African variant, I would have written Novavax in the face of South African variant still prevents severe death, hospitalization, and severe illness, hospitalization, and death. So that's the important thing to remember, is those three are what we really worry about: severe death, severe illness, hospitalization, and death. And I do think that there might be a need to update the vaccines. We'll see whether it is, but I think really what I'm worried about is the severe consequences. And I think the vaccines do well. And remember, several months ago, the FDA would have approved something at 50% efficacy. I think a lot of us got spoiled when you saw the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which were kind of off the chart. So now 50% became poor when we would have been cheering for a 50% vaccine. So if we would have reversed this and Johnson & Johnson and Novavax South African data would have came out first, I think we'd have a totally different narrative than what happened with Pfizer and Moderna coming out first with those big 90% numbers.
I guess that takes me to one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, which is, what are some of the biggest missteps that you see in the press right now in reporting about the vaccines, and what would you caution people against, whether it's how you've seen stories framed, or like you pointed to earlier, sort of pointing to what the vaccines don't do as opposed to what they do successfully?
I think it's the biggest thing is what they do. Thinking about why we have a vaccine. Why did we only now make a coronavirus vaccine when we've had 4 coronaviruses that have been causing 25% of our common colds for decades and decades and decades? It's because of the severe disease component. That's why we care about COVID-19. If COVID-19 acted like OC43, which is one of the other common cold-causing coronaviruses, nobody would really care. And in fact, nobody did care about those viruses until we saw their more dangerous relatives appear, like SARS and MERS and now COVID-19. So I think that's the point, is that this vaccine is being designed to tame the virus. It's to turn it into those other common cold-causing coronaviruses, which are burdensome. They cause problems. People take off work. There are some people who get hospitalized with them, but they're never public health emergencies, and they never threaten the hospital's capacity. That's the important point. That's what we're trying to get to. And I think that there is this misconception in the press and maybe in the general public that we're somehow going to get to COVID-19 zero. That's not possible. This is a efficiently spreading respiratory virus that comes from a family of viruses that are endemic. So this is going to be a seasonal coronavirus. It's not going to disappear magically. It's not going to be smallpox. It's not eradicable. So I think trying to think about how we move forward with the vaccine, and the vaccine being something that will not get us to zero. We're still going to have COVID cases 3 years from now. They're just not going to be that worrisome because they're not going to occur in bulk and they're not going to threaten a hospital. That's I think the nuance that's getting missed there, because people are underselling the vaccines then. Because if they think that we have to get down to COVID zero, then obviously they're going to undersell the vaccines, because this isn't the smallpox vaccine and this isn't smallpox. So if the way to talk about these vaccines, I think, is about how safe you are now from severe disease, from being hospitalized. And I think that needs to be emphasized a lot more than, oh, you could still be an asymptomatic spreader, or don't ever, you got these 2 vaccines, you waited 2 months, but don't change anything. Don't hug anybody. And then shaming people for doing that, or shaming someone who's been vaccinated and has gotten 2 weeks they've gotten 2 weeks, they've waited, they got their robust immunity, and then they're excited because they go to a restaurant and eat indoors, and then all of a sudden that becomes a story that this is immoral behavior. I think that type of thing is going to just discourage people from getting a vaccine, because if you can't change the vaccine is supposed to enhance your life. You're supposed to be able to do things more, or you're supposed to have some improvement in your life. That's why we want people to get the vaccine. But if it doesn't, then people aren't going to get it. And I think that's something that's trickling in. There's this kind of undercurrent going on. And I think that maybe it's a little different between how I talk to a patient that I've been taking care of that got vaccinated. Yes, you're much more safer, versus a population level message. There's a little bit of disconnect there, because you see the public health experts being more reticent to say that, but what they might say to an individual patient in front of them is a little bit different. But I think that's one of the big disconnects I see with this vaccine, kind of tied into that COVID zero remark, and then really not realizing about the severe consequences of disease that the vaccines were designed to stop.
Well, I think, you hit on a point that has a lot of people confused, which is, what can people do safely once they're vaccinated? And I think there's probably 2 groups. What can they do safely with other people who are not vaccinated? and what can they do with other people who are also fully vaccinated? I know that's one of the top questions that we get from readers.
Yeah, so this is interesting because I've been asked these questions throughout the pandemic. Is it safe to? And then ... And I can't ever answer you what that question other than to say, well, you have, it's up to you. It's going to be a risk calculation you have to make. It's not, is it safe to? Because everything has a non-zero risk when you step out the door. So you have to think, is this worth it? I do think the vaccine makes that risk calculation easier because now you can kind of discount it for the fact that you've got a vaccine on board, and if you've gotten 2 doses and waited those 2 weeks, you're extremely unlikely to get symptomatic disease and not really going to end up hospitalized. So the question then becomes, what about the other people that you're around? Is there a risk that you could be an asymptomatic carrier? And I think the data is emerging. Most of us in the infectious disease field believe that this is going to decrease transmission, and we're already seeing that in some of the Israeli data. And there's also data that's coming out showing that people who are vaccinated, that viral load, that it decreases viral loads, it decreases a lot of things that would be correlated with transmissibility. It's going to take some time, however, for public health guidance to catch up with what many of us believe to be the case. And it is true that the more people that are vaccinated, the less you have to worry about that. And I would say if you are 2 people who are vaccinated on the same time frame, there should be no restrictions between, there doesn't need to be any other restrictions. For every other type of activity, it's what I've said from the beginning. I actually wrote a piece for the Washington Post on this a long time ago about risk calculation, that you've got to think, is it worth it? And for some things, for a grandmother to see their grandchild, it might be worth it. And I'm not going to stand in the way of that. It's just a risk that people have to learn how to accept. And I think we're very poor in this country when it comes to risk calculation. Everybody kind of has this dichotomy of never leave your house or pretend that it's your 21st birthday. Nobody can actually kind of thread that line and do things in a responsible manner that decrease the risk and the damage the virus causes while still being able to enjoy some of those activities. And I think that's what we kind of have to do, is find that path. And the vaccine makes it easier, but I think in general, it's going to take some time though for the public health guidance to catch up. Once we get the data, I think you'll see a lot more things happen. And even when we get our vulnerable populations vaccinated, those nursing home residents or community dwelling elderly, you're going to see hospital numbers drop, you're going to see deaths drop, and then the risk perception of the disease is going to change, because as the vulnerable populations get protected, we will be taming this virus. So I think stay tuned, but I think that we have to think about ways that people can move forward with their life with this vaccine.
I think one of the other big stories around the vaccine has been the very troubled rollout these last few weeks. At the end of last year, Trump administration officials were saying they expected to vaccinate 20 million people by the end of the year. I think by the first week of January, it was close to 4.1, 4.2 million. What did you see as some of the biggest obstacles in the rollout? And could infectious disease scientists and specialists, public health officials, see those problems coming well ahead of time? And what could reporters do to maybe highlight what some of those issues are?
We definitely saw those problems coming because many of us were around during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic and saw basically an identical type of thing happen, where you had the federal government kind of abdicating responsibility to the states and the states being unable or unequipped to do so. So that was something that's something we thought was going to happen. That's why a lot of us are saying we need to start planning for this, not just at the 30,000 foot level in the summer, but very tactical stuff in the summer with funding. Because remember, those health departments that are organizing these vaccination clinics and mass vaccination sites are the same people that are doing testing sites, the same people that are doing contact tracing, and they've been under-resourced for decades and decades. So it's really impossible for them to be able to just move and deliver this vaccine the way Amazon delivers packages. It just was not going to happen. And the same is true at hospitals that were doing a lot of the phase 1A. There's not a person that was a COVID vaccinator 2 years ago. These are people that have other jobs that are getting pulled to do this. And hospitals are, at the same time that the vaccine was rolling out in late December, hospitals had their highest numbers of patients there. So it was a lot of difficulty. And they were worried about, do we vaccinate our entire staff today and then they all call off sick tomorrow? What happens then? So there's a lot of that happens. And then there was also the fact that we worked very hard to come up with priority groups that made sense from an epidemiological standpoint. But what ended up happening is people started looking at them like dogmatic 10 commandments. And if you deviated from them, it was the worst thing in the world, that you would rather put a vaccine in the trash can than put it into a phase 1B or, God forbid, a 1C person before you did it, is basically what would happen. And you had governors like Governor Cuomo saying, not only will I fine you if you vaccinate a phase 1B ahead of a phase 1A, I will take your license. mean, that's a recipe to put a vaccine in a trash can. And so this kind of misguided dogmatism really made it much harder. And then it's not easy to get this vaccine. You got to sign up, you've got to fill out a consent form, you've got to go there, you got to get your vaccine, you got to sit there for 15 minutes, then you leave, and then repeat again in 3 or 4 weeks. That's not like getting a flu vaccine. Even for me as a doctor, when I want a flu vaccine, I just like bang on a door and say, hey, can someone give me a flu vaccine? And I just get it and I'm out the door before they even get a Band-Aid on my arm. This isn't the same thing. There's a logistical problem here. So a lot of that had to do with it. And I think what we need to do now is really make this the commitment, or the biggest priorities, to get vaccine into people's arms and pull out all the stops. Just a couple of weeks, like last week, they had snow days at their vaccination clinics in New York and New Jersey. I'll tell you, the virus didn't take a snow day that day, but we took a snow day. I mean, you can't have these kind of logistical issues plaguing it. So this was something that I think was very well predicted. I think journalists it would be interesting for journalists to look at the 2009 H1N1 rollout in their towns and then compare it, because I think you'll see a lot of parallels.
Do you think some of these problems are being addressed now? President Biden is pushing through a $1.9 trillion relief plan, which includes a good bit of money for vaccines. There was the $900 billion bill in December. Do you think that these issues are starting to be resolved or addressed, or do you think we still have a long way to go?
They are starting to get addressed. I think during the Trump administration, you basically saw an abdication of the federal government, where they basically said, this is a state's problem, we delivered the vaccine. But now I think we're seeing we're seeing a lot more of engagement from the federal government. But it's interesting because the states that basically did it alone, like West Virginia, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, they're the ones that are excelling, where they didn't wait for federal response. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon that you're seeing. But I do think it could be better. I think for those people who try to get a vaccine, you have to be savvy and tenacious. And if you're an 85-year-old that doesn't use the internet that much, and you don't have grandchildren or somebody to do this for you, it's very difficult. It's like trying to get tickets to like a Madonna concert or something like that. You have to keep refreshing and have multiple things open. I don't think that that's ideal. You should just be able to get these the way you can do anything. I mean, we do so many things so easily, like with Amazon or whatever it might be. I think we have to move to that type of a paradigm, especially as we start vaccinating outside of these priority groups. This is the easy part, the priority groups. Once we're starting to do people in community dwelling areas, I think it's going to be difficult when we have to battle vaccine hesitancy, all of that. So we have to really upgrade. And I think that I do applaud the Biden administration being involved in not allowing the states to falter and meeting states where they are, but we have to go forward without any kind of speed limit. We shouldn't, we as quickly as we can get vaccine into people's arms. And I think we shouldn't allow the priority groups to be a barrier to getting vaccine into people's arms.
Are there other things that journalists should be looking for in terms of accountability stories, or when they're talking to state and local officials or federal officials about what else needs to be done, for the quote unquote last mile to actually get the vaccines into people's arms?
I do think it's important to think about, what the states have on hand, how much is sitting in the freezer, how much is left over on a weekend. That's important. Trying to ask, how many doses did you have to give away? What is your policy for when, at the end of the day, when you've got leftover doses? Do you have a backup call, a friends and family list? Are you able to just go out into the street and grab people and get them vaccinated? That's really important to know, because that tells you how efficiently they're doing this. I also think, in places where they're talking about we don't have enough people to staff these vaccination clinics, why aren't they using dentists? Why aren't they using veterinarians? There's ways to do this. And some state pharmacy boards, for example, make a pharmacist go through like X hours and pay all this money to be able to vaccinate. I think all of that's another angle, is the regulatory burden to get pharmacists to be able to vaccinate in some states is so high that most pharmacists are going to say, why should I? There's not really much. I don't have the time to do that. I have another job. And that's another important angle there.
I know that the Biden administration initially said they wanted to vaccinate 1 million people per day. They've recently upped that to 1.5 million people per day. Do you think the country's on track to meet that goal? And I mean, how quickly do you expect to be able to see a ramp up of the number of people being vaccinated per day?
I think we'll probably get 1.5. We've had, I think, some 1.6 million days. So we're already sort of hitting that towards the twilight hours of the Trump administration. So I think that we want to not have any limit. I think that should be the bare minimum, and that we probably want to get 2 million, 3 million doses into people if we really, really wanted to do this at a speed that's going to keep ahead of the variants, keep ahead of what's going on. and I do think that the government should be held accountable. Right now, this is probably the most important task that they have to do. So I think we have to hold them accountable. And a lot of us in the field were very excited that we had a new administration that was really listening to all of us about what to do. But I think we can't become complacent and not criticize when they need to be criticized. And we need to hold them to that. And we need to make sure they're pulling out all the stops and that this becomes a priority.
What questions should reporters be asking federal officials to make sure that they are doing, they've said they're going to throw everything at this, that this is their number one priority. What questions should reporters be asking, these federal officials in terms of how they're conducting the vaccination campaign, what resources they're throwing to it, maybe addressing some of the regulatory burdens that you had brought up earlier? I mean, what are some of the questions that you would be asking them?
I would be asking them, what can the role, how can we use the military? How can we use the National Guard? What about this kind of bickering that's going on between states and the federal government? Sometimes states say, well, the federal government says this, but we don't know that. And then the federal government will say, well, we've gave that to the state. We don't know what they're talking about. I mean, you can't let that just sit. That's happening all over the place. And the same thing is happening at the state level to county level officials. County levels it's kind of trickling down. So I think trying to exactly figure out when you see this kind of disconnect between the federal and state government, pinning it down and understanding what's happening there and kind of exposing it and shedding light on why they have this. Asking the federal government, what should states be doing? Should they be giving all of their doses out? And because you guys are going to definitely get them their second doses in time, or how should they do that? Because some states are still holding back second doses because they don't trust the federal government to be able to deliver. Are they able to really, President Biden talked about having 3 weeks of visibility into the supply. Is that actually happening? Talk to the state vaccine coordinator. Say, do you have 3 weeks visibility? Do you know when you're getting the vaccine and where it's coming? That's important to know as well. Are there differences between the way states and counties are getting their allocation, or some counties are getting it directly, some are getting it from the state? And then there are some places where you've got state and county dueling, or state and municipal government dueling with separate vaccine clinics, which makes it very difficult to know what to do. And I think New York is an example where they have state vaccine clinics as well as New York City vaccine clinics. How do you navigate that? And where's that vaccine allocation coming from? And are they pinching off each other's supply? That's another important thing to focus on.
Who do you think are some of the biggest sort of pools of untapped sources when it comes to reporting this story? You have sort of the obvious people, the federal officials, in charge of various aspects of vaccine distribution, and state officials and health department officials. But, I think everyone's looking to kind of get creative and to find different sources of information, try to find different problem areas. I think you've highlighted a few really good ones. So who do you think are some of the biggest pools of untapped sources as people are reporting this, both on the national and the local level?
I think county health department officials probably are your good sources, and they'll probably talk to you on background if they're not allowed to. They'll tell you exactly what's happening on a very nitty gritty granular level about, this vaccine that was supposed to come to this address. It came over here. We had to drive over there. We didn't know it. And then the state took it because the state thought it was for them. Those types of things I think would be interesting. So local health department officials, the same equivalent at hospitals, because hospitals are taking shipments, trying to ask a hospital, say, okay, we're sitting here on Monday. How much vaccine do you have on hand? When is your next shipment? What day is it coming? And how many are going to be in it? Asking them these very simple questions, just to take in a day in the life of a vaccine administrator at a hospital or at a county health department. I think that would be useful. And I think you guys have done stories on people and how many times they have to refresh the screen and how many websites they're on. Those are important stories as well. I think, and I think even maybe the people even transporting the vaccine, to see how do their orders come out, where are they ordered to go, how quickly do they know that they're going to have a vaccine pickup, that kind of thing. Do they ever get redirected? That would be interesting to know as well. I mean, I think there's a lot of the details and logistics, because that's where this is failing. I think that would be important to know.
I want to bring in one question from one of the panelists. So the question is, what can a journalist make of the term back-end distribution? The explanation is, in New Jersey, the governor said we were probably only doing 100 and something thousand a week because of supply constraints. And then the quote is, our target continues to be 70% of the adult population, 4.7 million vaccinated. Can we get there sometime in the 4th of July Memorial Day window? And the response to that question was, it's going to be more back end than we would like. You are better off with an even cadence. 2 or 300,000 a week is better off.
I'm not sure I understand that question completely. Do you get?
I guess the answer to the reporter's question about whether they would vaccinate about 4.7 million by the summer in New
Okay.
Jersey.
Yeah.
Someone
So
said it's going to be more back end than we'd like.
yeah. So I think that, yeah, it's not going to be, it's not all of a sudden going to be ramped. I think that we're going to see the ramp go up towards the end as more vaccines become available. If you look at the way the contracts are with Moderna and Pfizer, where the delivery dates are, when Johnson & Johnson might come online. So I think we're going to see kind of a slow and steady, but going up, but not necessarily an exponential rise. And then when other vaccines come on board, imagine, a Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a single dose vaccine, doesn't require cold chain logistics. You don't have to sit there for 15 minutes afterwards. That's something you could do much quicker. You can bring it closer to patients. So you can basically have mobile things pull up in someone's neighborhood and everybody go outside and get vaccinated. So I think that that's something you will probably see, that it will be much more rapid when we're in the summer than we are in the winter and during this period of time where there's limited numbers, where they're still fussing over priority groups. Yeah, so I do think it will be more back end loaded.
And we have another question, I think a bit to your point about how, the vaccine news is really quite astonishing, and maybe that's people aren't fully registering that. And the question is, whether you have thoughts about how storytellers, journalists can build a narrative about the amazing innovations in the vaccines, like the advent of an mRNA vaccine, that I think for some reporters, it's been difficult to try to think of a way to frame these stories to make people really excited about what this scientific innovation means.
Yeah, so I've been somebody who's been a fan of vaccine platforms and mRNA vaccines even before this pandemic, and wrote a big report on what they do. I think the story is how quickly this was made. If you look at what Moderna did, they basically had a vaccine candidate within days of the sequencing of the virus. That's unheard of. And this was a technology that had been developed for over a decade, but we hadn't seen any products built from it. And when they put them through clinical trials, many of us didn't know how an mRNA vaccine would do. And they basically shattered all the records that we would have seen in a vaccine, especially one developed in less than a year. So I think that's really important. And the story is how quickly this could be scaled, and how quickly and how easily mRNA vaccines could be adapted to other targets. That's what I think is interesting, that this is going to change the way we face emerging infectious disease in the future, that our first vaccines for the next outbreak, the next infectious disease crisis, is going to likely be an mRNA vaccine because they prove their worth. And you have to think, when we talk about vaccines, they're not very lucrative for companies. They don't want to go into emerging infectious diseases because they're unpredictable. Who's going to pay for it? What if it never comes and we lost all this money? But with an mRNA vaccine, they can basically use that same technology to make vaccines against cancer. That's really where Moderna got its start. And then they can use those economies of scales and use that same technology to make vaccines for infectious diseases. So I think there's going to be hopefully a renaissance of vaccines against things that people didn't find lucrative enough or the business case strong enough to make. And I think that's part of the story that's interesting to tell, because I think we will likely see more and more infectious disease vaccines that were out of reach come into reach after COVID-19. Not only because of people being so attuned to the risk of infectious disease now, but because the technology was allowed to mature. And it's not just mRNA vaccines, it's the adenovirus vectors that are in the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine, other types of vaccine platforms like Novavax. All of these things are going to flourish. And I think that's an important story.
I think a lot of people who are reporting on this story are a bit new to science reporting, or maybe science reporting is not necessarily their training. What sources of information do you recommend for reporters who are trying to get up to speed and report on the vaccine? And what are, I think, some of the pitfalls that you think people should avoid when they're trying to look for science information, or maybe trying to wrap their heads around the more complicated aspects of this story?
So I think that, one of the places, if you're not a science journalist or a healthcare journalist, is to look for, there's leaders in the field, including you, to read the work that certain science journalists have been doing for some time. So I heavily recommend Stat News, because they've got, it's not only journalism, it's also very educational, where you can get a lot of details there. I would read some of the more breezier medical journal articles. So you might find things in the New England Journal or JAMA that are in the front material, where they're kind of covering it as a news. That will get you up to speed. I think just having types of events like this, where you can ask direct questions to people on or off the record, that's really useful as well. Just a tutorial, especially to understand how do vaccines work. And even if that's not talking to some high flying expert, but maybe you're talking to the biology professor or your family doctor, that type of thing. So you get that kind of grounding to understand the basics are what to do. It's very hard, even for someone in the field like myself, to keep up. It changes every minute. There's new emails with new things coming out. So it's very, very hard. So I do rely on journalists more so than I have myself in other pandemics, because they're sort of getting it's a 24/7 news cycle, and they're churning out so much. So it's sometimes easier to look at those stories and then go to the journal articles versus vice versa. But I would really look at the science journalists as the leaders in the field as the ones where you can get a lot of information, a lot of sources, and then sort of the 101 on it, and then just try to be creative at trying to just gain that context and knowledge that you might not have from not covering science and healthcare before.
Well, we have another question, which I think is probably one that's been big at the local level too, which is, if you could talk a little bit about alternative dosing strategies, because there seem to be arguments about widening the interval between the vaccine doses or delaying the second dose to ease the current vaccine shortage issue. So do you think that's something that could potentially work, and what are the risks around that? I think importantly also for people to understand what are the limitations and what scientists understand right now about whether you can delay or have sort of alternative dosing schedules.
So it's important to remember both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were designed as 2-dose vaccines. So that's where the clinical trial data is. There was no single dose arm. But what we know is that after the first dose of those vaccines, about 7 to 10 days later, we did see a drop off in infection. So there clearly is protection that's garnered after the first dose. But the big open question is, how long does that last, and how durable is it? Because everybody got a second dose, and we know that second dose boosted neutralizing antibodies significantly. So that's why a lot of people want to be on a 2-dose regimen, because we don't have data on a single dose regimen. We don't know how durable it is. But I think the other issue is that right now, because we're in this crisis, there's a question not of skipping the second dose, but of just taking all of the supply that we have to get as many single doses into people to decrease the burden of infection, and then make sure we get everybody with the second dose, to use that word on the back end of it, to get people, because we know that the second dose is going to work no matter when you get it. You don't have to restart the series if your second dose comes at 5 weeks versus 4 weeks for the Moderna or something like that. So we can get people the second dose, and then they get that protection. But do you leave them too vulnerable if you increase that interval, meaning between your first and second dose? Is that period of vulnerability before you get your second dose, is that too much to bear? Will that drive variants, for example, because people have partial immunity at that time? That's an open question, and I think Dr. Fauci has said that's what he's worried about. Other people are saying we'll be able to catch up and get people their second dose, maybe not exactly on 3 and 4 weeks, but maybe it's 5 or 6 weeks. So I think that this is something that's important to discuss and think about, and I do think that the federal government is telling people, do not hold back second doses right now. Just give everybody their first dose. We'll backfill you. And if that can be met, I think that's the way we should do it, that we should be putting vaccine into people's arms and not holding back for the second dose, but not skipping the second dose, making sure that we do get people those second doses. Hopefully a lot of this discussion will start to fade away once the Johnson & Johnson vaccine gets emergency use approval, since it's single dose. But that's sort of where I fall on it. And I think it's getting a little bit misinterpreted, because I think it's not about skipping the second dose forever. It's can you delay it a little bit, because we're going to be able to meet that demand and get more first doses into people's, because again, this, like we said earlier, this is all backfilled. The more doses are coming over time, not up front.
Well, I think, this sort of brings up another thing that reporters are struggling with, which is the science around this is changing so quickly. It's evolving quickly. And then a lot of questions that we just don't know the answers to come up in the course of, addressing the pandemic or in vaccine distribution. I mean, what is the best way for reporters to deal with these questions that, science hasn't been able to answer them yet, or there's sort of, different camps or mixed opinions? I mean, these questions do inevitably come up. So what's the best way to deal with them without contributing to, misinformation or further confusion in an already very overwhelming situation?
I think it's presenting experts that have both opinions, and then trying to put a context to those opinions about where that comes from, trying to show what the biological principle is that people are relying on. Because a lot of times when we don't have an official scientific answer, we do have a lot of background biology principles that usually govern how these things act. Sometimes they don't necessarily completely apply, but I think you can explain, this is why certain scientists think such and such, and this is why certain scientists think such and such. These are the biological principles that they're drawing on from experience with this vaccine or this virus or whatever it might be. I think that provides a basis, because sometimes people think that we're just kind of making it up, or that they don't understand where the rationale or the reasoning comes in. It's usually from extrapolating from other viruses and relying on kind of tried and true biological principles that persist in many different contexts. And I think that's something, I think probably because there's a lot less scientific literacy, so people don't necessarily think about that. But I think that's one way to contextualize it.
Do you think the media has been contributing to vaccine hesitancy in any way in its reporting? Whether it's the framing of headlines or just the uncertainty around this, sort of looking for where there might be potential problems. I mean, I guess I'll just start with the broader question, which is, have you seen the media contributing to hesitancy at all?
I haven't seen journalists contributing to it, but I definitely have seen headline writers doing it, because they'll say, woman dies after vaccination, and then like in small print, after being struck by a car or something like that. They don't put that contextual, but they make a lot of clickbait headlines. So they do sometimes. So something will happen after a vaccine, and then that becomes a story. Such and such, grew a third head or something. They put that becomes the headline. It's not. It's usually something, somebody died, or somebody had some severe reaction, but they don't contextualize it, saying yes, but the normal rate of people having a stroke on a given day that of this age is this. So this is not above the normal. They don't put that in there, or that you can't fit that in a headline, or your headline writers no one will click on it if you write all of that. So that's one thing where they do that with the vaccines, or so-and-so got infected after their first dose. Of course, that's why it's a 2-dose regimen. So that's basically what, there's a lot of that happens. And then I think some of the doom and gloom that we talked about earlier, saying that this vaccine, this is why we still have to do all this stuff, and not kind of giving people the hope that the vaccine represents. I think that also will get people to say, well, I just read in the newspaper that I can't do nobody cares if I got the vaccine anyway. I'm never going to be able to do anything anymore. That type of thing also, I think plays a role in vaccine hesitancy. Not so much in this first phase where these people are healthcare workers and nursing home residents, but as we get into the general population, I think it's going to be important to do it. And then, I also think there was so many people were like writing these articles about these vaccine cards, and it's like this flimsy piece of paper, and people think it's like a microchip in your head, and it's literally a piece of paper that just tells you come back for your second dose at this time. That, I think that got people all scared that they were getting microchipped by these little vaccine cards, or they were calling them vaccine passports, and really it is like a flimsy thing. If it went through the wash, it would be gone. It's not. And then I told a lot of reporters asked me about these vaccine cards, and I was like, well, I have a yellow fever vaccine card. Like, boy, what's that? I never heard of a yellow fever vaccine card. But those have been around for like decades and decades and decades. So I think that's one thing where people said, okay, you get this new vaccine card. But I was like, what's not new? We have a yellow fever vaccine card. And every time you get a vaccine, your pediatrician was supposed to stamp your little book that you're supposed to keep. And I'm the only nerd that kept mine or asked for mine to keep. But that's not unusual. So I think that also contributes to a little bit of hesitancy, getting people all hyper that you've got this vaccine card that people are going to look at when you go to the grocery store and all of this type of stuff.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. So I want to ask one more from the panelists, and then I want to end on a note of hope, just so we can all, I think we could all use that. So the question from the panelists is, if a person has a first dose of mRNA vaccine and has an adverse event, can they wait for the J&J vaccine, and how long would they have to wait for J&J to be safe?
I think yes, the mRNA and the J&J vaccine are totally different technologies. So I do think you could probably wait. You could probably wait and hold on and get the J&J vaccine without a problem. I don't think that they've defined a interval. Obviously, I think it's going to end up being probably several weeks probably between the two. There's not really data to define that. I think it's probably going to be something you have to discuss with your doctor and just decide what the proper interval is. The ACIP may come up with some kind of guidance, because there may have been enough people that had side effects from Moderna and Pfizer that they didn't get their second dose. So I think that and it also might be something that Johnson & Johnson might want to put you in a clinical trial to see that you're getting what's called a prime boost, a prime with the mRNA and then a boost with the J&J, which is these mixed match trials that are going on all over the country. So that might be something to think about. But yes, I think likely that you'll be able to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I don't know what the interval would be. I think it'd probably be fine just to get it after you're over your side effects from the first vaccine, because they're using two different technologies. But I think we'll need to get more data to be able to say that for sure.
And I think I just want to end by asking you, I've seen a lot of stories, and I was having this conversation with a colleague about how a lot of stories sort of seem to project there will never be an end to the pandemic. And we were asking each other, what are some more positive stories that we can write for people right now? What are the reasons to, believe that things will continue to get better, that things will eventually turn around? So, I mean, we talked about how, the vaccines in some cases are kind of underplayed and the efficacy of them. What are some of the more positive aspects of this, these big breakthrough innovations? Obviously the record development of these vaccines, what are some of the more positive stories people can be writing right now? And are there reasons for hope right now, that journalists can project to the general public?
So I would like to see stories about, some elderly person who got their 2 doses of vaccine and then went and saw their grandchildren, even though there be people that would shame them for that because of this technical, all of that kind of people fighting. But those types of stories would be interesting to see, that this is what happened when they got vaccinated. This is what they were able to, that changed their risk calculation. So now they're more comfortable doing such and such. Or what happens in certain, I think that's probably the one thing that nobody is writing about, because there's that taboo about talking about what you can do after. But I think people are doing that after they get their 2 vaccines. So I think that's an important thing to highlight, even if they're going to get people shaming them. But I think it's, at least the doctors at least the physicians would probably support that type of thing. It's a little bit different with how the public health officials might say that. I think that's important. And then, maybe thinking about how companies or businesses or other organizations are thinking about going back to normal, what they're going to do, what their thresholds are for opening things so that people have something to look forward to. I think looking at, for example, I think the examples of the sports leagues and how they were able to keep the virus from impinging on them, I think those are important stories, because that can be replicated at another level. I think that's interesting. I'm trying to think what other those are probably what I would like to see. I think it's going to take some time and also thinking about the concept of harm reduction, which we talk about with HIV, injection drug use, substance abuse disorders, sexually transmitted infections. That seems to have gone out the window when it comes to COVID. Many people don't want to talk about harm reduction. And I think that's an important thing, is to say, yes, we know that there's always going to be COVID-19, but we've reduced the harm by doing X, Y, and Z. I think that type of thing, trying to marry what went on in the HIV field when we thought about things like pre-exposure prophylaxis or condoms or giving or all of that stuff. People don't want to talk about that when it comes to COVID-19. It's basically everybody went to abstinence only when it came to COVID-19. And I think that's very puzzling to me, because of how much data we had on people's ability to comply with public health recommendations when you moved away from an abstinence only approach and one of harm reduction. So I think that's an interesting angle too.
Well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions today, and I think helping us think through a lot of news stories that we can think through and work on. Is there anything that you'd like to add that we didn't touch on, or that I didn't ask you about during this panel, that you think is important for people to keep in mind?
Just remember, this isn't the first time. You're going to have to do this again. There's going to be another infectious disease emergency, another pandemic. So don't forget these skills and try and contextualize everything in the fact that infectious disease threats are not one-off, they're continual.
Well, many thanks to both of you. This was great. I feel like we jumped into the deep end, and that was wonderful. Many thanks to Dr. Adalja and to Yasmin, and many thanks to the Commonwealth Fund for making this possible. And I want to make sure that you all come back tomorrow for our session at the same time on tracking vaccine distribution with editors from Bloomberg News. And so goodbye, everybody, and thank you. Bye.